The climate which new converts experience in the local church has profound impact on their spiritual development. According to Chic, the church should be like a hospital nursery where newborn Christians receive special care and nourishment. In the following message, he speaks about the church's need to have enough love to keep these spiritual infants warm. Chic is professor of evangelism at Nazarene Theological Seminary. He is known as both a theorist and a doer. His ministry of teaching, pastoring, and evangelism has touched many lives. Let's think with Chic about the climate for newborn Christians in your congregation.
If we're not winning new people to Christ, I don't blame the sinners. I ask myself, does my church have enough love to keep them warm? That was the concept Evangelist Moody Schoonover taught me years ago, and I began to realize the church is like a hospital nursery. In the hospital, when babies are born, I've never heard of the doctor saying to that newborn baby 3 minutes after his birth, "Okay, baby, you go home now, live your life, take care of yourself, get along the best you can." No, every hospital today in our culture has a nursery where those new babies are taken to be cared for. They have a special diet, special germ-free atmosphere, special nurses, special warmth, special care, until they are strong enough to finally be sent home. Even there they have continuing care. I know it wouldn't make me happy, and I don't think it would make you happy, if you knew that in your family a new child was to be born, and also to know that in 3 weeks the child would die because nobody cared for it. What if God gave your church 5 new adults converted to Christ this week? 3 weeks from now, what would be their spiritual condition? Would they still be living? Would it bring glory to God to bring 5 new adult converts into spiritual life if God already knows that in 3 weeks they'll all die because no one cared? So often it seems like the present members of the church will stand with folded arms and look at that new seeker and seem to say, "Okay, we're going to see if you're really serious. We're going to see if you make it. We're going to see if you mean business, and if you do, then we'll accept you." That isn't the church with enough love to keep them warm. The church with enough love to keep them warm is like the hospital nursery, and immediately goes to their aid. From the moment of birth, there is care, there is nurture. There are those who especially guide that new Christian, feeding him the Word, directing his Christian life, praying for him, supporting him. The church with enough love to keep them warm. And I saw this lived out in the life of a new couple. Let me tell you about Dan and Judy. Dan was raised in a Nazarene parsonage. I don't know why this happens, but sometimes it does. And he grew up to be rebellious against God. By 12 years of age, he was smoking. And at 16, he was cynical and critical and fault-finding. And a few years later, when he married Judy, one thing he cautioned Judy: you never want to be a Nazarene. You never want to go to the Nazarene church. He was in the service and stationed in a southern city in service of his country shortly after their marriage, and one day he had the news that his mother was quite ill. He said, "Judy, would you be willing to go and visit Mom for a few days and cheer her up? I can't go to see her because of my service obligations." So she traveled the miles northward to go visit that mom, and for a few days she was staying in the home of Dan's preacher dad and Dan's mother. She found out that Dan had been telling her a great big lie. For quite the contrary to what he said, she sensed there was warmth and love in that home. I don't know if Dan's mother planned her illness this way or not, but she didn't go to the hospital till Monday, and that meant that they all went to church together on Sunday. And do you know what happened on Sunday? On that day, Judy found the Lord, and Jesus Christ really touched her. When she went home with the news that she had found the Lord, to finally tell Dan, her husband, he was very upset. Here his wife had gotten saved, and worst of all, had gotten saved in a Nazarene church. He began to plot ways to get her to backslide. Over these months, as she was struggling to establish her Christian life, finally he came to the end of his career in the service, and he was discharged, and then he moved to another city where he started work as an insurance claims adjuster. Shortly after they had moved to that city and he had started that new job, Judy became sick. She went to the doctor, and the doctor said, "I'm sorry to tell you, you're suffering from a tumor or a cyst that is already the size of a grapefruit." She went home to tell Dan. She said, Dan, the doctor tells me about this condition and I'm upset about it. Would you mind if I would call your folks? He said, no, I don't mind. And so she called long distance and told them of her condition. And she said when she heard on the other end of the line that voice saying, don't worry, Judy, we'll pray for you, suddenly her fear left and she knew everything would be all right. Can you imagine the amazement of doctors? When they wheeled her into surgery that day, and the operating surgeon turned to those who were assisting him and said, just before surgery, I want to examine her again, and then looked up from the examination and said, I don't understand this, but the tumor we came to remove is already gone. And apparently the great physician got to her just before the human physician did. And when she was discharged from the hospital and told her husband, Dan, they didn't have to operate, they didn't have to take out anything, Dan said, Judy, I don't know why I've been so angry against God and against spiritual things. I know it's because the church and Christian people prayed for you that you were healed. And I'll tell you what, I'm going to change my attitude, and we're going to go to church together this Sunday. Well, because his background was in a Nazarene parsonage, he decided he wanted to visit the Nazarene church. And so that Sunday, the formerly bitter and now beginning to soften Dan and the newly converted and struggling Judy went out to a Nazarene church. I don't know what happened that day. Maybe it was just an off day for that church. But it seemed like when they went to the church that Sunday, few people shook hands with them. Nobody sat beside them. It seemed like everybody was so busy visiting and sitting with their friends that they were left all alone. And nobody took them out to dinner. No one called in their home that week. And Dan and Judy talked about it afterwards, and Dan said, I don't understand it, Judy. Dad's church was real friendly. But they didn't give up, and so the next week they went to a second Nazarene church with the hope that they would find a church that they could feel really at home in. But the same thing happened the second week. I guess nobody sat with them. Few people shook their hands. No lay family called in their home. Nobody invited them home to dinner. It almost seemed as if some people stood around at the door of the church, and when Dan and Judy came in, they turned and looked at them as if to say, what are you doing here? We don't know you. You're new to us. Are you going to try to break into our fellowship? And the second week they went home discouraged. They had gone looking for a warm heart, and it seemed like all they found was a cold shoulder. But before the third weekend came, another couple, seeing their plight, got in contact with them. And the man said to Dan, he said, Dan, listen, I'll tell you the church to go to. And he mentioned a church that was known for its warmth and love and care of people. And so for the third Sunday, this couple went out to seek another church. Isn't it sad? When the purpose for which the church exists starts to happen, and couples began to come, that the church is not prepared to receive them, to love them, to care for them. But the third week, the third church was different. And that week, they had just gotten in the service and were there just a few minutes, and Dan nudged Judy and he said, honey, I think we found our church. Because churches that have love like this, you can almost feel it in the atmosphere. Yes, I've been in that church, and I've seen the love of that church. I've seen as many as 7 men lined up in a row, waiting to shake hands with someone new who was visiting in the service. I've seen that church where in evening services, the crowds have been so big in the excitement of special services, they had to carry in chairs to seat everybody. The time I was visiting in that church, they were running about 160 in attendance, and there was a young couple in that church who made it their goal to visit in the home of every new couple that came to their church or have that couple into their home for a meal within 1 week after they had first attended. And I saw that church reach out to Dan and Judy. On Sunday, they were in the services. There Monday, the pastor left for district assembly. He didn't get home until Thursday, but Friday he went over to call on Dan and Judy. As he bounded up the front steps of their porch, Dan came out on the porch to meet him and put his hand out and took him by the hand and said, Pastor, it's sure good to see you. And then he said, your laymen have already been here. That was that lay couple I was talking about that made it their goal to get into every home within 1 week. And the pastor said as he sat around and talked to Dan and Judy that night, he sensed that Dan was very close to the kingdom. The next day, the pastor prayed, oh, God, give me a new sermon, and through Saturday he worked on a new sermon that he felt would especially speak to Dan, for he expected him to be in church Sunday morning. And Sunday morning the pastor got up to preach, and he looked out, and Dan and Judy were sitting out there. The pastor preached the best he knew how and gave his invitation, and sure enough, as soon as he gave the invitation, he looked, and there was Dan stepping out in the aisle, heading right toward the altar to pray. His arms were swinging, and he came down to the altar and knelt and began to pray, and the pastor leaned over and said, "Dan, has the Lord forgiven you?" And Dan looked up. I can see him now, rugged face, handsome, the tears running down his cheeks, and he said, "Pastor, I only had to ask once. Isn't that just like the Lord?" And then the next day Dan got on the phone and he called his dad. And he said, "Dad, I want to tell you that yesterday I met a lifelong friend of yours." And his dad said, "What, there in your city?" And he said, "Yes, Dad, in this city." And the dad said, "Well, Dan, who was it?" "Oh," he said, "Dad, it was the Lord Jesus Christ." You can imagine there was a happy dad that day. Well, the next Sunday, Dan and Judy were back in church, and they both came to the altar again to seek and find God's sanctifying grace. The next Sunday, they were back again, and they each stood before the church and joined the church and affirmed membership vows before God and that body of believers. The next week, they'd each had a part in leading their first souls to Christ, and the fifth week, they were back again in the special revival services that were going on. Indeed, they were not only there Sunday morning, but every night through the week, except for one night when his business called him away. And on the Sunday morning service, another new couple came to the church, a young engineer and his wife, and when the invitation was given, the engineer's wife came to pray. The engineer was shy, and he held back, and he didn't come to pray that day. But when the service was dismissed and people were going out, I had gone to the door to shake hands with people, and I was close enough so I could hear a conversation. And Dan and Judy had come back to that engineer and his wife, and they were talking to them, and I heard Dan as he stuck out his hand to that engineer and shook his hand warmly and said, "Oh, listen, it's really great to have you folks here at our church today. And we're going to have to get together this week. Why don't you folks plan to come over to our house?" And he laid out the plans for those two getting together that week. And I thought, just think, 6 weeks ago, this couple, Dan and Judy, were looking for a church with enough love to keep them warm. And now this Sunday, they are a part of the church with enough love to keep them warm. Does your church have enough love to keep them warm?
Thank you for listening to the Holiness Today podcast. If you enjoyed this production and wish to hear more, visit holinesstoday.org/podcast or find us on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts.